And so things like water gauging stations that are important for informing the public about flood stages, particularly right now in Alaska as we get into spring and things begin to melt. So that's something that is continuing to take place. However, we have a number of mandates within the state of Alaska from Department of Health, from the governor's office, from municipalities and communities that also have to go into those sort of decision-making procedures about field work. So many communities are basically closed at this point, and that list is continuing to be updated, but a lot of communities, particularly rural communities, don't want visitors at this point because they're concerned about public health, especially for elder and elderly populations within their communities. So, so right now we've also limited field work only to that which can be reached by road. And for the people that are participating in that work, they have to arrive at those locations in separate vehicles. So they can't be sharing cars, for example. And then once they get to that workstation, they have to keep a safe distance from each other, following the guidelines for social distancing. So if all that can take place, then the work can go forward. None of that work is taking place in the ecosystems office, so I'm not directly sort of related to that work at this point. So I'm not sure of any sort of other details I could offer on, say, for example, checking water gauge stations at this point, or other field work that might be taking place in other offices. But if folks are interested in details, I could try to find those for you. But for the ecosystems group, it's a major disruption, as you can imagine. We have a lot of field campaigns planned for this summer, a lot of community visits planned to update folks on what we're doing and why, and get their feedback. So all that's on hold through the end of May, and we'll make decisions about June and July fieldwork within the next few weeks. But at this point, we're trying to sort of postpone those decisions as long as possible, just to see if there are going to be some changes in the state that might allow some of that work to take place. But at this point, it really doesn't seem like it, given how much we want to be aware of everyone's safety, and also the fact that we will be bringing up helicopter pilots and airplane pilots and seasonal staff from out of state, which is also on hold. But if that were to happen, that sort of leads to the potential for spread among different members of a research team or a work team. So everything's kind of up in the air, but we do have a long list of projects and when things might start, when we need to make decisions by. And so we'll sort of address those on a case-by-case basis as things change. But at this point, everything's sort of on hold. And trying to see if there's any other things I want to mention here from my notes. I think that's about it, but I'd be happy to take any questions about anything in particular that people want to know about USGS work, or just some of the things that I mentioned.
Thanks, John. Any questions for John?
Yeah, and I'd be curious too, just to sort of hear from other folks too, and maybe after Mike's presentation too, just how other folks are hearing agencies approach this. I was on a call, I think Meredith, you were part of that last Monday, and a number of federal agencies gave updates on how they're approaching this, and it's really kind of all over the map. I think everyone's got a slightly different situation, different challenges and sort of different hopes that things might change. So there's not sort of a clear-cut single response. The one difference from that would be what I've heard from Canadian Wildlife Service, is that all field work in the Arctic north of 60 degrees latitude was canceled through September. So that's been the only unified decision I've heard from an agency in North America at this point.
All right, thanks, John. Mike?
Yeah, all right, hello everyone. So I'll give a couple of comments about impacts that this COVID-19 situation is having to above, and then some general comments about NASA as well. And then I'll invite, since Peter and Libby are both on, I'll invite them to make some comments on anything that I might have missed. And it's really great to see you all here, especially some of our above PIs and affiliated investigators. So a couple of weeks ago, we made the decision to cancel the above airborne data collection campaign for the summer of 2020, and we're currently planning on rescheduling that, hopefully for the summer of 2021. Regarding fieldwork, we're strongly discouraging all of our principal investigators from conducting any sort of planned fieldwork that they had for the 2020 field season. We're advising PIs to follow federal, state, and local guidelines, as well as the guidelines of their home institutions. And most home institutions in terms of universities are under travel bans anyways. And so we don't expect a lot of our PIs to be able to go out into the field anyway. And we really did this to protect the health and safety of our employees, our investigators, as well as local indigenous populations in Alaska and also the Yukon and Northwest Territories in which we operate. Although these fieldwork cancellations aren't ideal for our funded research projects, it could have been much worse. Above is actually in a unique situation. So it's a 10-year program, and we're about we're partially into that with phase 1 just wrapping up and phase 2 just beginning. So most of the fieldwork for Above was focused in phase 1, and most of those projects have concluded. So didn't have planned fieldwork. Of the phase 2 projects and continuing projects that did have fieldwork, I think because the phase 2 projects are new, delaying their field season by 1 year doesn't have a huge impact on their science. And then regarding continuing phase 1 projects, they have multiple years of data previous to this field season. And so having 1 year data gap, although not ideal, can be accommodated. One of the other things that we had to do was cancel the Above Science Team meeting, which was supposed to be held in Fairbanks the week of May 11th. And that was going to be followed by a fire management workshop being led by Allison York. We decided to convert this to a virtual meeting, which is going to be spread out over two 90-minute blocks across 3 days. And we moved the meeting from, this is going to be a virtual meeting. We moved it to June 1st to 4th, following the conclusion of the academic semester. And we decided to do this to better accommodate any of our PIs that are academics that are now working with trying to figure out how to deal with teaching in a new online environment while balancing the numerous demands of their home life work balance, given, especially people that have children to homeschool now. One of the silver linings here is that, typically we have to limit participation in the Above meetings due to space. So we can only really invite funded PIs and a select number of people from funded projects. But now this is going to a virtual meeting, we have some latitude on opening up participation to people that can't typically attend an Above Science Team meeting. So hopefully we'll be able to do that depending on capacity of some of the virtual tools that we're going to be using. We are hoping to do the Above Science Team meeting in Fairbanks in the spring of 2021, and then hopefully that can also be followed by this fire management workshop that we're hoping to do with Allison York. I guess the other thing from the NASA perspective is, NASA continues to collect Earth observation satellite data at a global scale, and we have planned for continuity of operations while protecting the health and welfare and safety of our employees. There really has been no interruption on the acquisition or processing or distribution of any of our satellite or climate data. We are able to keep things operational while manning things remotely, keeping on-site staff at a minimal level. So I'll invite Peter, comments from Peter or Libby as well, and then we can open that up to questions for NASA.
Yeah, that covered it pretty well, Mike. I'm only aware of one of our funded teams in Fairbanks that is operating within UAF guidelines and still doing field work, much as was previously mentioned, off the road and with social distancing for participants. We operate a logistics support office in Fairbanks, and we have scaled that operations of that back substantially. Pretty much the only thing an investigator can get is any gear that is theirs. They can take out of the office, but they can't put it back in. Otherwise, I think you pretty much hit it all.
All right, thanks. I don't know if Libby, you have anything to add?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. No, I think that's about it. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we'll take any questions, or we can have a wider discussion about other agencies' responses to the COVID-19 situation.
This is Nancy French. Real quick question. You mentioned, because we do have satellite acquisitions that are ongoing, we all like to have field, coincident field data collections, even though we don't have airborne. And I know that the restrictions in Northwest Territories go through the summer, but other places there may not be that long a restriction, or there may be opportunities for some limited observational field, what I will call field work. Is that going to be allowed, or is that something that we should do case by case? And for example, if we have people who live where the satellite's collecting relevant information, can we have them going out if they're following all of the local laws?
Yeah, I think we should probably discuss that on a case-by-case basis. But I mean, my initial reaction is, as long as everybody's following the guidelines of the federal, state, and local governments, as well as their home institutions, it's probably okay. But we should talk one-on-one about specific situations.
Okay. So just since nobody else is talking, my thought is that we will be using some of the satellite information that'll be collected, and whether we have people actually doing observations during satellite overpasses, it would still be really important to have comprehensive weather and other, information, coincidental information that we can get through other means available. So our team is going to be working on, making sure we get relevant weather information, finding out if there are any other types of ancillary data that can help us with that. And I'm assuming that the NASA support service will help us with anything that's needed there. You guys are still operating at some level, correct?
Are you meaning by support services, you mean Peter's office?
Yep, Peter's office.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, we're up. We're still operating for sure, and we can help you track down data sets. Specifically, when you mention weather, one of the things that comes to mind is the augmented weather observations that are taking place on the U.S. array seismic stations across Alaska and a little bit of Yukon. They have stood down their plan to start taking that network apart, which means that some of the stations that would have been removed this year will continue to work it through next year. So that data is available out of Meso West. It's not being ingested at the GMAO as part of GEOS 5. So depending on what product you're, where you're pulling the weather data from, Nancy, you may or may not find that.
Well, that's excellent. That's the kind of thing I'm, having people help us understand what's available. That might be something a little stealthy, like you just mentioned. That's excellent. Thanks.
Hmm.
All right, any additional comments or questions?
This is David Butman again from the University of Washington. I just had a quick question, and tell me right now, this is not a venue, but I'm curious if there's been any more discussion about, given the fact that field operations have sort of been curtailed for this summer and a number of programs, how any change in personnel support might be addressed moving forward for when field campaigns can actually take place to do the work?
Yeah, that's something that Hank and I are currently trying to figure out. And so I don't have an answer for you today, but we're talking about it. And, you know, I'm sure that we have some things we can do to hopefully make things not so painful. But yeah, so hopefully you'll hear from us soon.
All right, we'll stay tuned.
I think that's something that many people and many different programs and agencies are asking right now. So yep, certainly on a lot of our minds. All right, last chance for questions or comments on this topic before we move on to the planning activities. Okay, well, thanks, Mike and John. Really appreciate that. And now, Meredith, you want to take back over?
Sure, yes, I will. So I'm going to share my screen now and just walk everyone through a little bit of where we are and what we're talking about today or during this part of the agenda. So the IARPC, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, of which this Terrestrial Ecosystems Collaboration Team is a part of, they operate under a 5-year Arctic research plan, and each of, and this plan is divided up into chapters, and currently each of those chapters correspond with a collaboration team. And I'll go ahead and just show everyone this list of the different collaboration teams. And these teams are implementing the 5-year Arctic Research Plan, which is an interagency plan to help federal agencies coordinate how to move forward with Arctic research. And so we're operating under the current plan, and that plan extends until the end of 2021. And so we have begun thinking about the next 5-year Arctic research plan and what should be, and developing that plan. So we're at the very beginning of that process right now. And I'm just going to share in the chat some information for everyone where you can find this. A Federal Register notice has just been posted, and we're encouraging people to respond to that Federal Register notice in a way that makes sense for you individually or within your organization. We're also going to devote some time today to take comments from people on what you think should be included in the next 5-year research plan in terms of terrestrial ecosystems research, or if you have ideas on how the plan might be restructured. We're also interested in hearing those. So this is a venue here to get input from the terrestrial ecosystems research community on what is important to include in the next 5-year plan. And I'll just back up a minute to, again, the terrestrial ecosystems team is implementing the 5-year Arctic research plan. We have, they have performance elements that they are responsible for, and these are part of the plan, and that you can view them and you can view progress on what has been done on each performance element. So I would encourage, if you want some background information, to look through that. Of course, we're asking people for comments today, but it might take you more time to kind of collect your thoughts around this. And so the Federal Register notice will be open. We're extending the deadline until August 2nd, as of right now. So that's where we are. And I'm going, now I have access to the chat. Okay, I'm going to put some of these links in the chat for everyone. And then if you have questions, feel free to ask. And the last thing I'll say is that is to point everyone to this website, this webpage again. So here it is. And on the right, you'll see upcoming events where, sorry, letting someone else into the meeting here. Okay, upcoming events where we'll be discussing these, links to the Federal Register notice, previous webinars, as well as who is on the Plan Development Steering Group. There's background information here. The current 5-year Arctic Research Plan is here in full, as well as other resources. And then we have a timeline that I will be updating later today. But we are now in this early part of the development piece. So we are in, there has been no drafting of the plan as of yet. This is a Federal Register notice period where we're just asking for what people think, just a general kind of scoping notice before any pen has been put to paper. And then we'll take all of those comments and synthesize them after the notice closes in August. And we will distill that information, and we're planning to have a workshop in September. And at that workshop, the participants will take the synthesized information and draft a kind of outline for the plan. And then there will be plan writing teams that will take that outline and fill in more detail. And then once the plan has been drafted, there will be a second Federal Register review process, and that on the draft plan. And after those comments are taken in, the plan will be released by the end of 2021 is the current goal. So if there are any questions on the process or on how these plans work in general, I'm happy to take that. And I will also put some just discussion questions in the chat that might be helpful to kind of frame the discussion here today. And I'll also start putting in some of the other web pages in the chat as well. So happy to take questions. And also on the call, we have John Pierce here, who is part of the Plan Development Steering Group. And so just wanted to point out that he is a part of that process also.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. I was just going to add, just to reemphasize what you said, that this is sort of announcement of a whiteboard. So we haven't started drafting anything. We've just been bringing people together to start thinking about what the next plan could look like. And so that's the reason for the Federal Register notice, is just to let people know we are starting this process and we want your input. Do you like the current plan? Do you not like it? What would you like to see changed? What format would work better for you and your community? How can we communicate with you? And we're having multiple meetings, not just in terms of developing the plan, but with Alaska Native and Indigenous groups to talk about best ways of communication. And that, this whiteboard is available. But we as, federal agencies and other groups have not yet started writing anything down formally. There's a lot of brainstorming going on, but only in certain groups, and we're waiting for other groups to weigh in. So that's kind of where the process is now.
Thanks, John. And so I put some discussion questions in the chat box that I thought could be useful to get people thinking. If you're familiar with the current 5-year Arctic research plan, or maybe the terrestrial, what the terrestrial team is doing, letting us know what the plan is doing well, what it's missing could be really helpful. What research should be included in the next 5-year plan, and how we might better integrate those studying terrestrial ecosystems into this process for getting input. And the last question is just about other suggestions for getting diverse perspectives.
One thing I was wondering if you could elaborate on a little bit more is how the development of this plan and the elements that are incorporated into this plan, how that relates to how the United States approaches international collaborations around Arctic issues, or how what we're doing as part of this plan plays into our stance as we cooperate with or work through other Pan-Arctic groups.
Yeah, Steve, that's a really good question. And I don't feel fully qualified to answer it, but I'm going to do my best. In terms of international engagement, there are a lot of different scales for that, but the Arctic Science Ministerial, not the most recent one, but the one prior to that happened in the US, the kind of objectives of that ministerial were directly tied to elements of the plan. And so the Arctic Research Plan was used to make those deliverables. So that's one way that that IARPC is tied internationally. We also, just as as a group that coordinates US federal agencies and has this like somewhat public website where things are reported and teams are tracking progress on activities, that is useful to groups like IASC to take the priorities of the US and the information that's being gathered and incorporate that into kind of the international understanding. I think there's probably a more on the ground answer from people who are actually like doing research with international collaborators, but so I would be interested in figuring out that answer as well. And so just any thoughts that anyone has, you can type them in the chat also, and I will take those and put them in comments in a spreadsheet that I've got. And if you are again, if you're interested in commenting more formally, the Federal Register notice is there and open.
Hi, this is Fred Hemrich. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I've been working with Arctic Observing Network data in Barrow and Akasuk. And one of the things that's been very valuable to me about the data set that I'm working with is the design of the data collection was such that I can easily scale from the ground measurements to pixel size is the size of Modis pixels, which is what we're normally working with. And so the fact that that design strategy is put in, that they sample an area large enough that I can do that, has been really valuable to me, that consideration. And it would be really nice if similar kinds of measurements were made in some other parts of the tundra landscape, to be able to look at how these, because I've got 10 years of data there, and I can start to look at trends, and trends that are at the scale of the satellite trends that we've been looking at. And it would be really nice if there were more sites that this was done at.
Fred, this is John. Can you talk a little bit more about what kind of data you're collecting at those sites, what that looks like?
So, well, I'm a consumer. I'm not collecting the data, but what they did is instead of just doing a few little plots, they have, they're collecting ground measured spectral reflectance and measurements of plant cover, plant species cover, in basically on the calm grid and they're measuring. So they're measuring it. They're sampling every 100 meters in an area about 500 meters by 500 meters, which is the size of a Modis pixel. So I'm getting, kind of an ongoing picture on the ground of the spectral reflectance and the vegetation characteristics, and that's carrying through in a standard way through 10 years, and I can track that, and it matches well with the satellite. It scales well to the satellite data, and it's it's at a scale and a temporal sampling, a decade of temporal sampling, that we can look at trends and actually compare that to these moderate scaled satellite trends, like from both Modis and AVHRR.
Yeah, maybe we should talk offline. I could let you know about some of the work folks in our office are doing with caribou forage and goose forage that might be of interest. They might be collecting some of those variables already.
That'd be great. Thank you.
And then Steve, I could provide one more update at some point when we're ready for that.
Please go ahead.
So one thing, just with Fred talking, that triggered in my brain that I could bring up to this group is a project that we're trying to work on with the North Borough. So Fish and Wildlife Service and Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council, which is basically a group that is indigenous and federal, that come together to manage migratory birds in the state, along with Alaska Department of Fish and Game. They have a 30-day closure window for when people can harvest migratory birds in the spring. So Alaska Native hunters can harvest birds in the spring up to that 30-day window, and then it's requested that nobody harvests during that 30-day period, and that corresponds with when birds are sitting on eggs and nesting. So they ask people not to harvest birds during that period so that the birds can go through the reproductive cycle. And then after that 30-day period, subsistence harvest is open again. So as you can imagine, that window of 30 days is changing over time. It's becoming earlier and earlier every year. And they're fixed in several regions of the state. And Alaska Native groups have asked if they can have flexible 30-day periods rather than fixed ones. And so the question is then, how do you develop on an annual basis that flexible 30-day window? Because in some years it will be early, and in other years it might be late. But consistently they're getting earlier. And so we've talked about gathering traditional knowledge across a spring landscape every year about the status of rivers, the status of breakup, but then also looking for what data exists out there on changes in spring conditions over time, potentially on an annual basis, so that they could, within say like a 2-week period, decide what that 30-day closure window should be. So right now the Yukon Delta is the best model that we have for this. There's a series of phone calls that are made among Native groups on the Yukon Delta to ask questions of local residents of what they're seeing out their windows. And then a group in Bethel works with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Bethel, Alaska to come up with a 30-day closure period. And then that's just announced across the radio. That's more difficult on the North Slope. There's fewer villages. And so there's been a request to see if we can merge what traditional knowledge exists every year with maybe some remote sensing data or on the ground measurements of those spring conditions to develop that 30-day closure period. So I'll just mention all that. And if folks in this group have ideas on that, we could talk about that now, or you're welcome to email me and we could explore some of those possibilities.
Thanks, John. And I guess I'm wondering, that was actually really interesting, and I hope that people do follow up with you with ideas. And I was going to ask Steve and Mike, as you know, the people who have been shepherding along this current plan along, and Mike is a newer team lead, so that might affect your answer a little bit, but just with your experience so far with the current plan, with the terrestrial ecosystems performance elements and the broader structure of the plan in general, are there things that you think are working well or things that are missing?
I guess I can make a comment or two, but keep in mind that, you know, I came into this position not too long ago, and so came into the plan midstream. I mean, I like having the structure of the plan there to help us sort of characterize and categorize our research that we are conducting through above specifically according to that. But I will say that some of the performance elements are really specific, and sometimes it can be hard to fit everything that we're doing into meeting one of those performance elements, for example. I think if there was an opportunity to write some of the elements just a little bit more broadly, I think a lot more of what we have been doing can fit into that, and a lot more of what we will be doing in the future can fit into it easier. So I guess that's just my general observation from being involved with this for almost 2 years now. I don't know if that's helpful or not, and it's not real specific, but.
It is helpful.
Yeah, I think I can imagine what elements in particular you're talking about. There's some language in there that is kind of hard to wrap the activities around. I would say that to date, we've had a lot of success in using those elements to help us frame reporting and subsequent discussions about what we have been doing, particularly at the agency level. But I think with this time around, this new 5-year plan, I think we should really concentrate on looking at opportunities to use those plan elements to help us actually frame efforts on the ground, that we can look for gaps in what's being done or particular areas where we need science to address an issue or a group of issues, and think about how we can really use that to push things along rather than just relying on this more as bins to put things in as we do our annual reporting and things of that nature. And if I could, just one more follow up to what John was reporting on there. This idea of, well, it's been framed in many different ways, phenological mismatches, changes in the timing of migrations or green ups or whatever it might be. But through the last few years of implementing this plan, this is a theme that has come up time and time again, is understanding how specific events or trends in the timing of events have changed over time, and trying to both capture that with observations, but then providing information that can help people in a management context understand how they can adapt to those changes. That has certainly been a recurring theme, and perhaps one that we should see if we can elevate to kind of the full element status within the next plan, but something that we should certainly keep in mind.
I wonder if there might be any comments from, I don't know how many of our above PIs are still on. I see a couple from any of our above PIs on sort of gaps or future directions that this new plan could help fill in.
So Mike, I think I need to spend time looking at what the current plan has versus what is possible with a new plan, since I'm not familiar with it. I'm assuming though that there's some remote sensing words in there. In other words, the plan includes how we can best exploit what's available for remote sensing.
Yeah, there are a couple performance elements within the terrestrial ecosystems area, as well as the permafrost area, as well as cryosphere and other spots that do specifically call out remote sensing and remote sensing data and modeling.
Okay.
All right, Meredith, Mike, looks like we're coming to the end of the hour here. Any last comments before we sign off?
I'll just say thank you to everyone for listening and considering, and really encourage you all to just take some time to think about this, and we'll continue to be open to further dialogue and thoughts.
And thanks also to John for joining us today, coming over from the coastal team, where he's also a collaboration team leader. And thanks also to Mike for doing double duty today in getting this meeting together, and also sharing some thoughts on the COVID-19 response. So thanks for me. And then Meredith, you want to take us out?
Yeah, thanks everyone. And this meeting will be recorded and the notes will be posted within the next week. So check back on the event page if you're interested.
All right, thanks Meredith. Thanks Steve and John. See ya.
Thanks everyone.